Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Halpin Exchange. Lovely to have you all here. My name's Shaun Horan. I'm the joint CEO of Halpin Partnership, and Halpin Exchange is a series that we're running to talk about issues in higher education and get some insights for all of us. We've done previous sessions on things like Black Lives Matter in HE. This one focuses on reflections from David Allen and his long and illustrious career in higher education. We're delighted to have you here today, David. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Just very briefly, for those of you who don't know, Halpin is a management consultancy for higher education. We work in governance, in strategy, in people and culture, and in development and alumni relations, doing things like reviewing performance to providing interims for people. I think that's all I need to say about Halpin for now. But what I will say is that David has been fundamental to our development as a firm. He was there at the very beginning of Halpin Partnership as a founding fellow. He was on our first ever project at the University of Bath. He's been a sage counsel to me, to Susie, to Charlotte in running this firm over the last 6 years or so. And he will also be our first fellow emeritus. So a whole number of firsts there, David, and thank you for your faith in us. We're going to talk about your career today, and just to give the audience a taste of where that started and where it's got to at this point, until we can persuade you back out of retirement, which we keep intending to do. Very briefly on you. So things started out for you in higher ed as an admin assistant. I think that title says a lot about the times, doesn't it? But in the University of Wales, registry in Cardiff in 1976. Moving on to be assistant registrar in a Welsh National School of Medicine in the 80s. Then deputy director of admin services at Southampton, my old alma mater. And then secretary at the University of Wales in 1991. Moving from there to be registrar at Nottingham, that university that's produced many great registrars, of course, in 94. On to registrar and secretary at Birmingham, and I know a former SU president from that period is also listening into this today. And then finally, registrar and deputy CEO at the University of Exeter in 2003, for a decade that really saw that university shift and change and progress, including it joining the Russell Group there. So some really significant things, which I'm sure we'll touch on today. So that's the kind of in-house part of the career. There was also then a period as a principal consultant at Perrott Labour, joining us as a principal consultant as well, as I say, 6 years ago, 2017. And including things like HEFQ in there, which you were chair of from 2014, a board member of an NHS trust in South Devon. I'm not sure how you fit all this in, David, but we're nearly there. Chair of Exeter College and FE College as well. And also, I think uniquely, chair of AUA and also AHUA, chair of both of those bodies, and a member of the board of the Leadership Foundation. So a whole number of things in higher ed there that stretch across things that have really defined higher education in the last 20, 30 years or so, including picking up an OBE there and an honorary doctorate and all sorts of things that have been more than deserved. David, an amazing career, all sorts of things that we can and will talk about there today. But I'd love to hear, just first of all, what it was that attracted you into higher ed in the first place.
Well, thanks, Shaun, and thanks for that very kind introduction. And it's good to see everybody virtually. Thank you very much for joining this conversation. I hope we have an interesting hour or so. I mean, I can't pretend that it was like wanting to be an astronaut or an engine driver. I kind of graduated in 73, I think it was, and I'd been working as a deck chair attendant, which was probably the best job I've ever had. And then I worked for a while in a housing department in local government. And I just happened to see a job advertised as an admin assistant in the University of Wales registry. which looked interesting. So, I wrote a handwritten letter of application, and I was lucky enough to be interviewed and appointed. And I was appointed by somebody called Bob Evans, who was the academic secretary and a bit of a legend in the University of Wales because he was so eccentric. And for example, when his television broke down, he phoned up the TV company and asked for the horizontal hold department. And he would knock on his own door and tell himself to come in. So he was a strange chap, but I learned a lot from him. And when I was appointed, he said, "Well, you've done very well. 300 people applied for this job." So I was congratulating myself. And he said, "I appointed you for 3 reasons. One is you look big enough to carry the academic board suitcase around Wales, and you could drive, and you'd worked in an office for a while." So, but anyway, as I started the work and started to visit all the universities in Wales, which was a great sort of apprenticeship, I got really kind of passionate about it, and particularly about students and their prospects and their welfare, and how all the different universities worked and so on. And so I started to feel that it was a very useful and interesting career, which I've always felt really. But I'd have to say in those days, administrators perhaps were rather looked down upon by the academic community. I remember going to an introductory course for university administrators in Leeds, where Sir Edward Boyle, who'd been Tory Education Secretary, was the Vice Chancellor. And he just started off by saying, when you get up in the morning, you should all look in the mirror and ask yourself, I know I'm an evil, but am I a necessary evil? And I kind of thought, well, this is a strange sort of thing to say to people coming in. And so one of the great things for me over the years is to see how much, and I think it's a generational change, professional services colleagues now are part of the team, including academic colleagues who deliver the mission for the students, for research and outreach and so on. So that's been a big change, and one which I've always sort of championed. So that was really how I started off, and there have been times, I suppose, when I've thought that I made the right decision, particularly in the first few years. But generally speaking, I think it's provided me with wonderful opportunities.
Yeah, some fascinating things in there, David. And who knew that you might find eccentricity in the world of higher education? I think that another thing I wanted to just reflect on there as we start this off, and you gave us a wonderful picture of the young David Allen going into that first job, being tall enough for it, which I think is interesting in itself. So apart from being tall enough, what advice would you give to your younger self? You look back over that career that you've had, things that you maybe wish you might have known at the beginning of that career that have helped you along the way.
Well, maybe to set up a consultancy business would have been a better idea, but that ship has sailed. Well, I think in terms of me, it would be different for others. I think maybe because I'm an only child, I was always hopeless at delegating. So certainly, I think more delegation, but of course, it's there's a limited amount of delegation you can do when you're a junior admin assistant. But I think over the years, I got to understand delegation better, and that there were lots of people who could do lots of things better than me. I think also to have confidence in your opinions and your judgments, because when you're a young professional services staff member, you're often in meetings with people who are much older and more experienced than you, more distinguished than you. And you hear them talk, and sometimes you think, well, I'm not sure that's quite right. But maybe you don't quite have the confidence, in your own judgment, and you think, well, they're much older and more experienced than me, so they must be right. But then over time, you see that maybe your views were correct and theirs weren't. So it gives you more confidence in terms of speaking up. So I think be confident in your opinions and in your judgments and express them, and be confident in the skills you have rather than the ones you don't. Because, again, I may just be just me, but I was used to think about all the skills I didn't have, particularly in IT, which was only just taking off in those days, rather than perhaps the skills I did have. And the skills I did have, I tended to discount, in favour of the ones I felt that other people had. So I think really it's about confidence, your judgment and your opinions. Don't be dazzled by people, and just be visible. Put yourself about and get yourself known.
It can be difficult, particularly I think in higher ed, can't it, when there are so many acronyms flying around and people who are very eminent in their fields to sit in a meeting and realize perhaps you do know something more about the subject that's on the table than the professor of whatever it might be. So I think that's really good advice for people just developing that confidence as they go. And maybe if we turn that to look at, I suppose, the other end of that career, David, thinking about some of that advice, lots of people joining the sector from other sectors to that COO position, COO registrar position as well. And we've seen a lot more variety, I think, of the people coming in. What advice would you give to those people? If you said, look, there are 3 things I would really think of that will help to make this role a success, what would you say to those people entering the profession now as that senior role?
Yeah, it's a good question, Shaun. I guess that there are fewer and fewer people like me who kind of, life served 40 odd years in higher education. More and more people coming in from outside the sector with the skills and experience the sector needs. And some have done very well. Some, it has to be said, have come a bit of a cropper. So I think a lot of it's about tuning into the culture and whether or not you agree with the culture and maybe you want to change it. At least initially, I think you have to kind of swim with the tide of the culture, because if you become too countercultural, you can start getting marginalized or not listened to. So, I mean, Woody Allen said 80% of life is just turning up. And I think before you even start, it's having 50, 60, 70 meetings in the diary with every possible department, individual, stakeholder you can think of, and be listening, but also to be seen to be listening. Because if you express your own views too much very early on, you may just get it completely wrong. And you need to listen to a wide range of opinion, I think, before you start settling on your own views and start expressing the things that you want to do, and build up a reservoir of trust and confidence in you before you start doing things that people will inevitably in a university disagree with. Because if you're a COO, Chief Operating Officer, you have to make decisions. You have to make calls between competing priorities, and some people aren't going to like it. I think also you need to beware of lobbying. I hadn't realized, certainly before I became a registrar, how much you get lobbied. And also actually how much you listen to. People kind of hang on what you say, even if it's only just an aside or something that's not meant very seriously. So I quickly learned that you had to weigh up carefully what you said, or people would be rushing off and doing things that you never really intended them to do. And people will also have, bees in their bonnet, which perhaps they've failed to land with the previous COO, and immediately start lobbying the next one. And you can easily, if you listen too much to them and do the things they say without having listened to a wider range of opinion, you can again suddenly find yourself coming a cropper because you've just listened to some very partial lobbying or things that some people particularly want to do, which might not be in the best interests of the university. And then I think it's vital to build relationships, particularly with all your close colleagues. And part of being a COO, of course, is to respect the professional autonomy of your colleagues, the finance director, the estates director, the HR director, whoever it might happen to be, while at the same time knowing enough about what they do to be credible and authoritative with them. So that balance, I think, is quite hard to strike. So to build those relationships, so within 6 months or so, you feel you've got a good, strong, trusting team. And then finally, I think, because it can be pretty full on, is just to remember to enjoy it, because there's so much satisfaction that comes out of working with all these brilliant people and traveling all around the world and so on. Sometimes the pressures, can make you forget to enjoy it. So I think it's kind of important to stand back and enjoy it and reflect on the privilege it gives you.
Yeah. I think lots of things that will be very familiar in there to all of us, David, not least that new minister point with people coming to you with the pet things that it didn't quite happen under the previous person. That certainly sounds familiar. I think in any leadership position there, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's a really interesting reflection there on the culture piece. And I think certainly the people I've seen be effective going to get within the culture first of all without seeming to push against everything immediately and try and achieve change very quickly. I think you can achieve change in HE, can't you? I mean, you've proved that at various places you've been, but it takes time. And I think the time and patience point there, listening, building relationships, then I think you can achieve change that goes along. And I'm sure we'll reflect on that as we go. But again, looking at that position and the way things change in universities, it often seems to be the way that there's a swing. So if you get somebody who is a unitary COO or registrar, it is then sometimes followed by a swing of the pendulum where you have, instead of one person, you have a number of directors who might answer directly to the leader of the institution. And you might say here, look, it depends on the institution, which would be fair enough. But in your view, what is the most effective structure that you've seen there? Is it that person who really leads those professional services on the one hand, or that devolved structure?
Well, I've experienced both. When I became Registrar of Nottingham in '94, it was a binary administration, as it was called then, and I had sort of half of it, and the Chief Financial Officer had the other half. And of course, you make it work by working together. But definitely it means that there's two separate sort of power bases, if you like. Not everyone is sitting around the same table. And then when I went to Birmingham, it was completely unitary. So everything outside the actual academic schools was my responsibility, basically. And I think at that time, Birmingham had the biggest professional services operation in the country. Of the two, I definitely prefer the unitary, although, I understand and appreciate there's arguments both ways, simply because you get everyone around one table and the unified leadership. And I always felt that was a big advantage, because what you don't really want silos, you want a seamless web of services with all the professional directors being responsible for their area and the leading professional, but equally being open to challenge, so that you're not just thinking about money or people or things. You're trying to get everything moving together to support the overall mission. And if you're all around one table, that makes it a lot easier. But I think you have to be a little bit careful under that model, because of course people can be suspicious of it, thinking that it accretes too much power to one individual and so on, which was why Colin Campbell, the Vice Chancellor of Nottingham, was always against it. He always said, I want 2 on 1, not 1 on 1. But I think as long as you're sensible about it, once you start saying, well, the finance director can't meet the VC without me being there, or, if you try and restrict leading professionals, then it's not going to work. You can't sort of suppress people. You have to have an open and sensible approach, and just not worry about all sorts of conversations happening with deputy vice chancellors and the vice chancellor that you might not be privy to, as long as everything's open and everyone knows what's going on. And also you can do things like building a professional services culture, working with professional staff in the academic schools to make sure you avoid duplication and make sure you carry out the support at the point where it's best needed, avoid duplication of resources, all those sorts of things. And with things like investors and people and all the various things you can develop to support a professional cadre of people, bring in cohorts of people who are both academics and professional services people through together, so they're working together. All those sort of developmental things are much easier to do, I think, if you've got a unified professional services. So of the two, I certainly think the unitary works better, with the caveats, that I've expressed about not making it too command and control.
We've got a number of people, I think, on the webinar today who will be directors of other services, probably answering into that COO role. And I guess just reflecting on what you said there, the openness and information flow, I guess as you said, it's fine for people to have other meetings, isn't it? I think as long as everybody's informed, I guess, for the COO in that role, I guess it's important to know what's happening even if you're not in the meeting at that particular point.
Yeah, so for example, the way I always tried to configure the professional services was to support the various functional DVCs.
Mm.
So, the international office would be configured to support the DVC International and so on and so forth. So that the DVCs felt they had the support they needed without having to get bogged down in line managing people. But again, you don't want the Vice Chancellor bogged down in too much sort of inward-looking line management. But equally, then you can all sit around the one table and develop the professional services as a whole. So when it works well, I think you get cakeism. You get your cake in, you get to eat it.
Well, and let's look at that professional services bit, David, because you said that's changed at the beginning, since you've come into this career, and I think I'm probably right in saying professional services probably wasn't a term at that point where you started. Be good just to hear a bit of a reflection on that. How professional the professional services are these days. There's still, I think, an almost inevitable divide there, but it sounded like you were saying it's a lot better than it was than when you started. And certainly, I've never heard anybody call me a necessary evil when I was on that side, thankfully.
Yeah, well, of course, I think it can feel a bit like you're a civilian. So if you're an administrator in the NHS and you're not a doctor or in the police or whatever, you can feel a bit of a civilian compared with the professors or the doctors or the police officers or whoever it happens to be. So it's important to break down those barriers. I suppose, well, when I was in the medical school in Cardiff, I did an MEd in educational administration. And I wrote a dissertation on professionalism in university administration. And it got me really interested in what a professional is, somebody who's got a body of knowledge, specialist knowledge that people can respect. Somebody who puts their clients before themselves, doesn't have self-interest, and so on. I mean, there's a whole list of things. And I just felt it was very important that university administrators, as they were called then, had that professional outlook. So that led me to get interested in what was then called the Conference of University Administrators, later became the Association of University Administrators when we merged with the Polytechnic Administrators well before the UK did it. And now it's great to see the Association of Higher Educational Professionals, AHEP, being set up. And I felt it was important for people in professional services roles to be regarded as professionals, to have a code of professional practice so that it's not me saying it, this is my professional code, makes it much easier for people to have some sort of postgraduate certificate validated by a university, the OU in the case of ours. So you could get a professional qualification, to have a peer-reviewed journal, which led to perspectives being launched. So in my time as chair of AUA from 98 to 2000, those were my three main priorities, and not through me, but through the hard work of lots of other people, we got there. And I think that was important in establishing the profession of university management and administration. And I think also moving away from the sort of gifted amateur principle that, you just recruit people with right minds and, make them academic related and let them get on with it. But actually more and more you're recruiting people with specific, very sort of technical professional skills, which are really required by universities. And so to meld all that together into something called professional services rather than lots and lots of specialist silos is very important for people in leadership positions in professional services. And then, that led to things like the Leadership Foundation being established and Advance HE and all the rest of it. So now I think the relationship is much more professional. There's much more mutual regard between academics and professional services staff. And certainly in the late 90s, John Larais, I remember in particular, me and others, I'm sure, who might be on the call, started using the term professional services, which seemed to stick. And so moving from sort of the administration building being called the Kremlin and so on, you got much more distributed really professional services that academics valued because it helped them to win research grants, recruit the best students, or be well resourced, or whatever it might have to be, develop IT, learning resources. When you can look back from a sort of 45, 50-year perspective on these things, it's incredible to see how it's grown and developed. But I also always felt that it should be in proportion, and that you shouldn't overtax academic schools, and that resource allocation should be very visible. So you're bottom slicing rather than top slicing. They keep every pound they earn. They're incentivized to earn, but equally they can see very clearly where their taxes go and what they get for paying their taxes, because after all, they're earning the income.
Yeah.
So you have to have a good balance, I think, between not overtaxing the academic community to provide too much overhead, but while at the same time providing the services, always with a view to improving the student experience and all the other things we have to do, but particularly it's for students. And also to ensure that you optimize academic time spent on teaching, research, and outreach, so that academics are doing what they do best, supported by professional staff.
Yeah. Yes, I guess it's key, isn't it, to remember that we're there supporting education and research and students, as you say, and we'll certainly come to that student experience part, which I think has just increased in importance as the decades have gone on there. I want to turn to the governance question, which strikes indifference into the hearts of many, and not many don't see governance at all, really, in many ways. But obviously, it's one of the things we look at very carefully, and that you've been very involved with throughout your career there. So it would be good to hear what, in your view, I suppose what governance is, but what part does it really play in making for good leadership in a university?
Well, I think if I could land just one point in this conversation, it would be, the absolute vital importance of good corporate governance and good academic governance. And of course, the more that you're exposed to it as a secretary to a governing body, the more you realize how critical it is. You can't always control what happens, but actually it's often not so much what happens, but how you deal with it and what the culture of governance is that enables you to deal with it. So, if you think that you might have a murderer in your hospital, or you've got, patients crying out for water at 3 o'clock in the morning, or whatever it might happen to be, the way to deal with it is probably not to say, how do we protect our organization? The way to deal with it is to listen to whistleblowers, to have very open culture of governance, not to have an overmighty chief executive, not to build up a false consensus, and to be very open to challenge, and to make sure the governing body has the comparative data it needs and the open culture it needs in order to challenge effectively. And if the whole organization can see that the governors are living the values of the organization and are role models for the whole organization, then it's less likely that people in the organization will do things which are unethical or immoral, or which, so you could imagine, for example, in 2007-8, there must have been lots of people in banks, who thought what the bank wanted was for them to lend money to people who couldn't repay it. And it wouldn't matter. And we all know where that led to. Or you could think of the police, not wanting to listen to the Hillsborough families. Again and again, we see these things where the people without a voice, without agency, turn out to be right. And so it's absolutely critical that the people who own the assets, the people who employ the staff, govern as well as they possibly can. And I think we've seen through our reviews, Shaun, that you mustn't be dazzled by the quality of a governing body. You often see people with the most wonderful CVs. And if you looked at the board of the CBI, absolutely dazzling people, but had a complete disaster. So in corporate governance, disaster is always just around the corner. I served on the board of an NHS trust where we were the NHS provider of the year. And then all of a sudden, through a disastrous employment tribunal, the chief executive resigned, the chair resigned, the vice chair resigned, and the regulator suddenly said that unless I took over as chair or acting chair, the monitor was going to send in the regulator was going to send in a turnaround team. So that made me really sensitized, I think, to, you must never be complacent about corporate governance. And then in terms of academic governance, I think that's more and more important, partly because the governing body has to assure the Office for Students about quality and standards, but equally because students and stakeholders have to be assured about quality and standards. So the quality of what the academic board is doing or the Senate is doing in terms of academic governance and how it can provide assurance to the corporate governing body, again, is absolutely vital. So, I can't emphasize enough really the importance of corporate governance and how fortunate we are to have so many people who are willing to give their time and their expertise pro bono to help govern universities, because it's the quality of the governance actually that's the guarantee of autonomy. And success is the guarantee of autonomy. You don't get autonomy just because you say you have. You have to earn it every day.
It's one of those things, isn't it, that you hope the governance is largely invisible until, something goes wrong. And that's when we often see that things haven't, enough attention hasn't been paid to the governance and checking that the right things are being followed. And the academic governance part, certainly we see that, don't we, with the role of Senate having been a bit downgraded, I think, over the years, and perhaps coming back now into being part of that three-legged stool that you've talked about there. Making sure that balance between the executive, the council, and Senate is right, and it isn't wobbling on one of those legs. So again, lots of important lessons there, Dave. And I think that the good to bad, how quickly things can go wrong. I think the good side of that is it's how quickly things can get repaired as well if you get the right people doing the right things, I guess, in the right roles. I'm going to monopolise you for another 5 minutes or so there, David. Time is racing along, and I do want to open it up to questions from the audience there as well. Do feel free, for those of you listening to us today, to start putting your questions through, and I will certainly address those to David in the next 5 minutes or so. But David, I'll just finish up with a couple of things there. It would be great just to hear about some of the key people who you've learned from over the period. Now, I think universities are such fascinating and amazing places, aren't they? Full of incredible people, deeply challenging places as well at various different times. But it would be good just to hear from your view of your career about some of those people who've really made a difference to you.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have a try, Shaun. I mean, the thing is, it's a bit invidious to pick. There's been so many. It's a bit difficult to pick out a small number of people. And indeed, looking at the list, I can see there are people I've worked with on the call who've been very influential and who've been great colleagues. But given you've asked me, I'm just going to pick out two people, both male as it happens, but I've had some fantastic female colleagues as well. I'd have to give a shout out to Steve Smith, Vice Chancellor of Exeter, because we worked so closely together for 10 years on a fantastic project, which was all about, taking Exeter from 35th in the league tables to top 10, Russell Group, international rankings and so on. We were able to succeed in doing that thanks to Steve's leadership. So I think that's quite a good case study of what you can do, when you've got a COO and a chief executive who are completely aligned and complementing each other. Yeah. And Steve's just such a great leader, an inspirational person. That I would certainly put Steve near the top of the list. But I'd just like to mention someone else, which really comes from going back to my time in the Welsh National School of Medicine. Which was a clinical school serving the whole of Wales and had some absolutely fantastic, academics, people like, Les Borsevich, for example, was professor of medicine there. And when I went there, I kind of felt perhaps what I do isn't very important compared to what they do when you see these fantastic medics who seem to have 8 or 9 days a week when the rest of us have 7. just do wonderful work actually treating patients, but researching and teaching, doing so much. They're just super people, really. They've got superpowers. And that's why I began to think, well, is this thing I'm doing really holding them back, or does it really matter very much? And I was working with a wonderful man called Reg Hall. And Reg was one of only 3 people I've ever met. One was Reg, another one was Seamus Heaney, who I met when they gave him an honorary degree in Birmingham, and Nelson Mandela, who I was fortunate enough to meet when a group of universities gave him an honorary degree at Buckingham Palace, who had a sort of saintly quality, I mean, just goodness seemed to just sort of emanate out of them. They had an aura about them. And Reg was known as Professor Thyroid. What he didn't know about the thyroid wasn't worth knowing. People would come to see him from all over the world. And I was working with him on a curriculum development committee, revising and trying to make the medical curriculum more interesting for students. And I was just having a discussion with Reg, and he said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry." He said, "I've got these ladies waiting to see me in the thyroid clinic. They've been waiting a long time. I'm going to have to go." I said, "Oh, terribly sorry, Reg." And off went Reg. But before he went, I just said to him, what we do, what I do, it doesn't seem to matter very much compared with what you do. And then the next day, Reg came along with his pull-along suitcase. He was just heading off to fly off to somewhere, and just poked his head around the door and said, "I've been thinking about what you said." He said, but he said, you mustn't think like that. He said, I couldn't do what I do if you didn't do what you do. And that really transformed things for me. And from thenceforth, I kind of felt, well, it is valued, it is important what we do, and therefore it's worth doing and worth continuing doing. And that led to a lot of my thinking about working in partnership with academics and professional development and so on. But such a wonderful man as Reg was able to say that.
Some incredible names in there, David, as well, and a number of names that of course everybody will know too as well, and just does show you the variety of things that happen in universities as well, which makes them such incredible places to work. I'm going to ask you one final question, then I'm going to turn to the audience. We've got some questions coming in there, but just before I do that, HE, amazing as it is, has had a lot of battering recently in various ways. It would be good, I guess, just to get your reflection on, how does it look now compared to the challenges of the past? I think we can often feel that it's worse now than it's been because of the various challenges that are happening. But again, looking back on that career, how do you feel where we are now compares to some of the challenges that have gone before?
Well, I think the headwinds are very, very strong at the moment because every income stream that universities have is under threat. International, clearly the cap on fees, home student fees, research, everything universities do is not really now making a financial contribution apart from international students, and that's more and more under threat. And where do you get a king's speech? And I don't think people always realize that, for example, in Asia, people will be sitting around with the family who are going to fund the fees, thinking about where should we go, which country, which university, which course, and if they see a massive authority figure like the King of England, as they would always say, rather than the King of the UK, talking about lack of quality in higher education courses. I think we just have to be very careful of the Ratner effect and what people will think, because they won't think, oh, it's a constitutional monarch, there's an election coming up, it's what the government has written. They'll think a massive authority figure is saying there's a problem with quality. So I think we have to be massively careful from government down how we present ourselves to the world. People talk about the Thatcher cuts, for example, in '81 being a very bad time, which I remember well, and it was. 46% cut in Salford, for example. But there were two saving graces. One was that the government paid for 10 years enhancement of pensions for people who left, not universities. And also we were given permission to charge fees for international students, which has led to the huge internationalization we see today. So I can't really remember a time where the headwinds are stronger. But equally, I think that people in universities can take confidence. And I chaired a regulator during the period and an FE college. So I saw what people were doing during the pandemic. And I think people can take a lot of confidence for the superb way they governed and managed their way through the pandemic with students and residents throughout the time. And that gives you the kind of confidence to face anything, I think. But it's going to be tough. There clearly has to be some sort of review to establish a new settlement for funding. But I think it really needs to be focused on funding and not everything else. It needs to be chaired by a massive figure that the government can't really say no to.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it will have to be done after the election. So it won't be an ideal time because, it's best to do it before election when you can get cross-party consensus. But I don't think it'll be possible without some sort of review, even though that will cause a delay. And there just needs to be an all grown-up conversation about students not really being immigrants and, presenting our best possible face to the world for international. If we are going to be a science and technology superpower, then all the policies have to be in place through visas and support for families and everything else that you need to create a science and technology superpower. So very strong headwinds, but I'm very confident that the governments and management of our universities will survive it, as they have in many cases for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And possibly, as you say, there another review coming, because it does seem difficult, doesn't it, to solve the funding issue with any particular flick of a policy switch. I think getting political consensus, which doesn't seem to exist at the moment, certainly.
Well, that's my view. I mean, I noticed Justin Greening is saying today that it's not necessary, and I know a lot of people think it's not necessary, but when you think of Lionel Robbins' report in the 60s, he was such a big figure and there was a lot of support for expansion. Ron Deering, again, he was the Chancellor of Nottingham, so I knew him well, another very big figure. His report made a big difference. Philip Auger, not so much. Not through any personal qualities of him, but just that there just hasn't been the response to it. So I can't see it happening other than by some sort of review, but very focused review on what needs to happen to create a more sustainable platform for resourcing universities.
Yeah. Well, we have that to look forward to, possibly, David, and if that happens, then you heard it here first, folks. But I'd like to open it out now. There's some questions coming in there from the audience too. Please do keep passing those through, everyone. It's your chance to ask some questions of David today. An interesting one there that's come in, just looking at who, you worked in universities all of that time. Who do you feel the unsung heroes are in universities there? Who are the hidden people that maybe don't get that much recognition most of the time?
Well, I mean, I was used to say in the office, nobody would notice if I was in London or overseas, but they'd soon notice if the person who cleaned the offices and the toilets wasn't around. So there are a huge number of staff who make a massive contribution, who are unsung in the sense that they're like a good referee or the ozone layer. You don't notice them unless they're not there. Technical staff, I think, is a good example in laboratories and supporting students and researchers, building machinery, equipment, keeping it running. But you don't really see them getting a huge profile, and yet they're vitally important. Research staff, postdocs, research assistants, often on fixed-term contracts, or not with massive security of tenure. Don't know whether they'll get an academic job. In fact, only a small proportion of them do. So there's a whole range of staff who I think of as very much part of the professional services. I think of somebody who's working as a cook or working as a security guard or whatever it might have to be, just as much as important part of the professional services as everybody else. And so if you can set simple, clear objectives, for example, in Exeter, we said we wanted to be in the top 10 by 2012. We did it by 2010. that will mean different things to different people. It'll be more perhaps nuanced to an academic. But what we wanted was for people to be able to go into the pub, and when people say, what do we do? A bit like the janitor at NASA, I'm trying to send a man to the moon. It's that sort of culture that you want, that everybody's working in it together. Everyone understands, what their role is, what their part is in the operation, and everybody is celebrated and thanked and respected for what they do.
It's those sort of pillar roles that we saw in the pandemic, I suppose, as well, isn't it? Those people who kept things ticking over, from delivery drivers to, people emptying the rubbish and so on. All those things were crucial that you'd soon notice if they didn't happen.
When you go to international or alumni receptions around the world, people don't ask how's the vice chancellor. They ask how's the steward or the security guy or the person who helped them within their hall of residence, or help them get accommodation. So those are the connections that people think are important.
Yeah. There's a question there from Caroline Dunn, looking at professional services. You've reflected there a lot on how they've changed over time. Do they still need to change and adapt? Is there a gap that needs to be met still there for professional services, and if so, how does that change and adaptation happen?
Well, I'm sure there'll be other people better qualified than me, really, because it's 10 years since I worked full-time in universities, but just sort of observing from the point of view of the chair of the regulator and working with Halpin, I think there's always room for development. And if we were doing this in 10 years' time, it would look very different. And I think what I always try to do is how, when I'm thinking of a decision or something that needs to be done, is to think, well, how is this, if I'm looking back in 10 years, how is this going to look? So that you're always trying to kind of move with the arc of history, and to take quite a binary view, because I think if you try to get too sort of fine-grained about the future, you're just going to get it wrong. I mean, even the people who are developing AI don't really understand, do they, how it's going to develop. So to give you an example, back in 2005-06, when fees first came in under Tony Blair, we just sat down and thought, well, let's take a binary approach. Which way is this going to go? Is it going to be more private contributions or public contributions? Well, the answer is obviously private. And therefore you think, well, it's time we start investing behind the student experience, which led to big investments in infrastructure and more staff and so on. And I think it's, as the professional services develop, it'll be different skills that will be required. And I think actually it's going to be very important, because it's so expensive to import those skills when they're much in demand and there are other sectors that can pay a lot more. It's very important to try and grow your own through developing more skills and apprenticeships, better job satisfaction, giving more prestige to people, recognizing more what they do, giving them more career advancement opportunities and so on. So I think there's likely to be a huge focus on how do we grow our own skills? How do we reward those skills and retain them? And I think the whole question of how we reward people in HE needs more scrutiny, because industrial relations and remuneration is still very much as it was in the 1970s. Yeah. So I'm sure there'll be lots of changes as professional services evolve. But the key thing is to always say to yourself, well, what have I done for students today? How has what I've done helped students? And how are we going to recruit and reward and develop students to have satisfying lives in the future? And if the professional services supports that in ways we can't even imagine at the moment, then they'll still be doing a good job.
It's partly that sort of flip side part of what you said about specialists, isn't it? Is, you still need those people who really thoroughly understand higher ed and come up through the system, so that you are growing your own, as well as bringing in those specialist services. And I know it's certainly been commented to me that part seemed to happen a bit less than it did, bringing people through who really just grow up through the system. And maybe some of that needs to happen again.
And I also think, Shaun, I know this is more controversial, and vice chancellors have come up and criticised me for this, but I felt for a long time that once you reach the top table, it should be possible for you to become a chief executive without being an academic, because you will have developed lots of leadership skills and experience, which can lead a university. And I'm glad to see now that occasionally starting to happen at Harper Adams, for example, and Gloucestershire, because I think it's important that we have a broad church of people leading universities. Otherwise, the gene pool gets quite shallow.
And that happened, didn't it, in the NHS some time ago, where you had professional managers coming in. It's been slower in HE. Why do you think that is on that?
Well, I think, and I mean, Glynis Breakwell, I know, did research on this. I think it's mainly because academic credibility is regarded as essential, and I can understand that, particularly in a research university. And of course, if you go around the world, leaders in universities all over the world are academics. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. We have some wonderful academic leaders. But all I'm saying is that there should be perhaps a more level playing field and more of a recognition that, if you're in a chief executive role where you don't have an academic background, as long as you're credible with academics, then you can compensate for that in the rest of the team through the deputies that you have.
Healthy mix, I guess, David, isn't it? That's different skills at the table. Great question here from Maxine Pennington. What do you think is the greatest impediment to good and effective governance in those reviews that we've done and the things that you've seen? What are the major challenges there to good governance?
Well, I think in all the reviews we've done, we've always managed to find 20 or 30 or so recommendations, so that there are always things, continuous improvement. I think I'm much more interested in culture than compliance, because complying, with great respect to Maxine, who I know is Secretary of CUC, the CUC guide isn't a massively high bar in terms of compliance. And so I think it's much more about culture and making sure that you've got, what you don't want is a governing body where student members or staff members are regarded as second-class citizens, where people just look to the non-execs, or where the front bench of the executives is just telling the governing body things rather than asking them, where it's defensive and not very receptive to challenge, where you haven't got a nominations process which has got lots of diversity in it, so it's, you don't have groupthink and very similar type of people. Where you're seeing students and staff on remuneration committees and nominations committees, as well as non-execs. So you're representing the sort of charitable public service side of universities, as well as the international competitive business side, where you're seeing good information, the governing body really being asked to make decisions, being closely connected with the institution, and where there are checks and balances on the vice chancellor, particularly if they're long serving. So they're not dominating the governing body, and an overmighty chief executive we've seen again and again, or an eccentric chief executive is where things start to go wrong if there's not a governing body strong enough to challenge and hold them in check. So those are the things I think we always look for in our governance reviews, and perhaps we're not too worried about a bit of lack of compliance as long as it's put right. You're looking to see that really inclusive, challenging culture.
It just so often comes down to behaviours, doesn't it, around the table there, and inclusiveness, as you say, there, making sure that all voices are heard and challenges are taken on board. The question also there, just a bit of crystal ball gazing, David. You've mentioned the commission, but what other changes do you think the next election might bring? What could we be looking at for the next 5 years in HE?
Well, I mean, I remember 97 when people were desperate for Tony Blair to come in. I mean, they really were. And it was a pretty bleak time, towards the end of the 90s for universities, which is why Deering, the Deering report was commissioned. And I mean, I don't want to be party political about it, but I don't get there's that sense at the moment of people desperate for Keir Starmer to come in. But I do get the sense that people think, the current government really has run out of road and it's time for a change. So I think one of the things will be stop doing a lot of the things at the moment, which are counterproductive. Um, just as there was a big policy announcement in '97 about giving the Bank of England independence, wouldn't it be nice if there was an announcement that, like the US, students will be taken out of immigration statistics? Um, because, of course, that wouldn't look to a new government as if it was trying to fiddle the figures. It would just look like a sensible way forward. Opinion polls show that the public don't think that international students are immigrants. And of course, there have to be proper checks and balances about disappearing into the economy and so on. But the vast majority of students and their families are here to complete their programs and then return to their countries to get good jobs. So I think that would be a big step forward. And ditto with immigration for research staff from other countries. You can't have a world-class research economy and science and technology economy and the knowledge economy, which you just can't build a top economy these days without that. You can't have that really without having flow of people. And if you price them out of the market through salary caps and so on, or don't allow their families to come, or you take 3 years to join the Horizon program, and then make a big song and a dance about it. Although, if it hadn't been for Brexit, we would all already been in it. Those sort of things, which have been huge wins for the UK. I mean, we've got far more out of the European Research Council and Horizon that we put in. So just stop doing things that are counterproductive to the building of a knowledge economy. I think that's part of it. Develop the sort of solution that Ian Diamond brought in Wales, although there's still not enough money. At least the architecture that he built to have a sustainable future, which included maintenance, included postgraduate, undergraduate, part-time, full-time, get a constitutional settlement around the sourcing of higher education, and stop fighting the culture wars, celebrate free speech, but also celebrate the important contributions that universities make to intellectual life. Continue to celebrate people coming into universities, because widening participation is crucial. And of course, an incoming tide lifts up all the boats. So clearly we need to work more with FE, we need to work more with skills apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships. But we also need, like every other advanced economy, lots of participation in higher education, particularly for less advantaged groups. So there are actually a lot of things that a new government can do, which wouldn't cost a lot of money, which is just stop doing things which are inimical to creating the sort of university sector we all want to see thrive.
David, I think you've answered in that question some of the very last point I'm going to put to you, and I won't get time to cover everyone's questions, I'm afraid, including the one from Hilary Lappin Scott as to whether you're thinking of writing a book on your career in HE. So I'll leave that one with you. You can percolate on that one. But final question from Matt Gorman, who I think appropriately was SU president when you were at Birmingham as registrar, who said, a number of challenges mentioned there. What are the reasons to be cheerful for higher ed? A good note to end on, perhaps.
Oh, I mean, I think there's always lots, and it's very important actually for leaders to be positive and optimistic. But I mean, there are lots of reasons. Having had experience of FE and health, although you may not think so, it's actually much better in higher education. And health and social care now are just so difficult. Universities do wonderful things and will continue to do wonderful things. They'll continue to attract wonderful people. They'll become more and more important in a world where you can't rely on any information. So if a university says something, then it's more likely to be regarded as authentic and authoritative. So the role will be more and more important. I think it still provides a range of very interesting careers and a very sort of pleasant environment. I mean, that might be challenged, but to me, a university with its campus and its own community is a special place, that can provide lots of support and services to students that might not be available in the community. But once they join the university, they're all suddenly available. Wellbeing, counselling, a whole raft of things. And we also get the chance to see academics doing their wonderful work and find out about all the things they're doing. And there's nothing more fascinating than listening to a top academic talking about their work. And, you know, to have the privilege of listening to climate scientists 20 years ago and everything they said now coming true was a real joy. So I would never discourage anyone from pursuing a career in higher education. You know, I'm really glad that I did. And you know, it's hard to think of anything that's more important and satisfying and crucial to the well-being of society than our universities, and they've stood the test of time. So long may they continue, and I'm really grateful to everyone who continues to work in them. And I hope that despite all the challenges, you know, they enjoy and get satisfaction out of the work.
David, thank you very much for that. That's a terrific message to end on. Thank you for doing this today and for sharing your insights there over what has been a long and very successful career. Thank you for everything you've done for Halpin as well, and you know, extending that on and going back in to help many other universities with the work that you've done there too. Your contributions have been immense across the board. We will continue to be seeking your counsel, that's for sure, in these next phases. So we won't let you go too far away. But for now, enormous thanks from us. I will bring the webinar to a close there, but thank you so much for what you've done on behalf of the sector. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Shaun. Thank you, everyone. Happy Christmas.